The year was 1566, and the air in the Low Countries was thick with tension. The quiet streets of cities like Antwerp and Ghent were about to be set ablaze by a wave of religious fervor that would change the course of history. It started with whispers, but soon those whispers turned into shouts, and the shouts into a roar. In the small town of Valenciennes, a group of men gathered in a field, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a bonfire. They were hedge preachers, men who had returned from exile in places like Emden and England, bringing with them the fire of the Reformed faith. Their words were like a spark to dry kindling, and soon the flames of rebellion spread across the land. These preachers, many of whom had been forced to flee their homes due to religious persecution, were now back, and they were determined to spread their message. They spoke of a God who demanded freedom, a God who would not tolerate the oppression of the Catholic Church. Their sermons were passionate and fiery, and they drew crowds of thousands. People from all walks of life, rich and poor, young and old, gathered to hear them speak. Some came out of curiosity, others out of conviction, but all were moved by the power of their words. In the city of Antwerp, the Reformed movement was particularly strong. The city's powerful guilds and merchants were drawn to the new faith, seeing in it a way to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church and the Spanish crown. The consistories, or governing bodies of the Reformed churches, were established to direct the new assemblies, and they quickly became a force to be reckoned with. These consistories were in constant contact with the refugee churches abroad and the leading Reformed churches within the Low Countries, forming a network of resistance. By the end of the year, Reformed congregations with their own consistories were functioning in at least 8 towns in the county of Holland alone. The Catholic authorities were taken aback by the speed and scale of this religious revolution. Government correspondence was filled with references to the Reformed religion, Calvinist services, and worship à la Huguenot. The term sectaries, or those of the new religion, was no longer sufficient to describe the movement. It had become a force to be reckoned with. The Reformed cause was not without its challenges. The political arguments put forward to persuade the Reformed to embrace the Augsburg Confession, a document that sought to reconcile Protestant and Catholic beliefs, were met with resistance. Theodore Beza, a prominent Reformed theologian, made known to his correspondents in the Low Countries the objections to the document held in Geneva. The powerful Antwerp Church actively opposed the Martinists, a rival Protestant group, further complicating the religious landscape. The movement cut across all social classes, from the poorest textile workers to the wealthiest merchants. In cities like Ghent and Antwerp, the Reformed faith attracted a diverse following, including a significant number of literate and skilled artisans. In rural areas, particularly in West Flanders, the movement was dominated by poorer workers and the propertyless. Despite this, the Reformed cause was generally stronger in the cities, where the concentration of people and ideas made it easier for the movement to gain traction. The nobility's role in the Reformed movement was more ambiguous. While some noble families, like those in the county of Holland, either adhered to the Reformed faith or tolerated heresy, many were more inclined to support or encourage the movement than to join it outright. Even prominent figures like Hendrik van Brederode, who was named Protector of the Faith late in 1566, did not publicly profess the Reformed creed. His personal library, for example, contained few Calvinist books, suggesting that his support was more political than religious. As the movement grew, so did the risks. The legal status of the Reformed faith became increasingly precarious, and the government, led by Margaret of Parma, began to take steps to reassert control. The Lutherans and the Reformed sought to collaborate to obtain freedom of worship, even going so far as to offer the king 3 million guilders in exchange for their rights. However, Philip II, The Spanish king was not to be bargained with. He rejected the offer, and the stage was set for a confrontation. In late November, a synod in Antwerp, attended by representatives from various Reformed churches, took a crucial step. They declared that subjects had the right to resist their magistrate by force if the magistrate broke the law or committed acts of violence. This decision marked a turning point, as it legitimized armed resistance to persecution. The Reformed churches began to raise funds to pay for troops and to defend their cause. The Lutherans, on the other hand, took a different approach. They rejected the use of force and urged their followers to remain steadfast in their faith, trusting in God to protect them. This stance isolated them from the more militant elements of the Reformed movement, which would prove crucial in the fight for independence and the establishment of Protestant worship in the northern half of the region. As the year drew to a close, the tensions continued to rise. The government sent troops to punish the wicked towns of Tournai and Valenciennes for allowing the celebration of Reformed sacraments. The cities refused to admit the soldiers, leading to open rebellion. The consistories of Flanders raised troops to defend the cities, but their efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. Valenciennes held out for 3 months but eventually fell, and the leaders of the rebellion, including the preacher Guy de Bray, paid with their lives. The first wave of open revolt in the Low Countries ended in a crushing defeat for the Protestant cause. Public Reformed worship was banned throughout the 17 provinces, and many of the movement's leaders and followers fled abroad. The remaining believers were forced to meet in secret, their numbers dwindling. Sporadic resistance continued in some areas, but by 1568, order had been largely restored, and the region was back under Catholic control. The arrival of the Duke of Alva in 1567 marked a new and more brutal phase in the suppression of the Reformed movement. He established the Council of Troubles, a special tribunal that tried and executed thousands of people accused of rebellion and heresy. The Duke also imposed new taxes and implemented the Crown's plan for new bishoprics, further eroding the region's traditional liberties. Despite the efforts of the refugee churches to support their brethren in the Low Countries, the Reformed cause seemed all but extinguished yet. In the darkness, a spark remained. The assemblies at Wesel in 1568 and Emden in 1571, viewed as the first national synods of the Dutch Reformed Church, aligned the institutions of the Netherlandish churches more closely with Genevan and French models. They adopted Calvin's 4 orders of ministers, called for regular meetings of regional, provincial, and national classes and synods, and emphasized the principle that no individual congregation could claim superiority over any other. The Emden Synod also recognized the Palatinate as a major center of authority within the Reformed world, adopting the Heidelberg Catechism for use in the Dutch-speaking churches. The situation in the Low Countries seemed bleak, but the spirit of resistance was far from broken. In April 1572, a group of Sea Beggars exiled Netherlanders who had taken to preying on Spanish shipping landed in the port of Brill. Finding no Spanish garrison, they decided to stay and liberate the neighboring towns. Their success was swift, and within a month, they had taken control of most of the cities in Holland and Zeeland. The people, disillusioned by Spanish tyranny, welcomed the beggars with open arms. In some cities, the rebel victory led to an immediate religious revolution. In Enkhuizen, a preacher who had previously kept his beliefs secret began to speak publicly, and the city's Groot Kerk was taken over, its images removed and a new pattern of worship instituted. New magistrates were chosen, and the remaining Catholic clergy were forced to flee. In other cities, the process was slower, but the establishment of Reformed worship gradually led to the abolition of Catholicism. The numbers of those who initially joined the Reformed churches were small, but the movement was growing. In Enkhuizen, just 156 people took part in the First Communion service, and in Dordrecht, the number was 368. Even in Middelburg, a center of early Reformed strength, only 660 people partook of the Lord's Supper after the city joined the revolt. William of Orange, the leader of the rebellion, decreed a policy of religious toleration. But the beggar soldiers, eager for revenge, disrupted Catholic processions, ransacked cloisters, and killed more than 40 Catholic clergymen. The Duke of Alva's counter-offensive in the fall of 1572 spread panic throughout the rebellious districts, and the slaughter of Naarden's inhabitants in December demonstrated that even towns that surrendered could expect no mercy. The stage was set for a long and bloody conflict, but the spirit of the Reformed movement was far from broken. The flames of rebellion had been kindled, and they would not be easily extinguished. After the beggars took over the Reformed churches, which were like new kids on the block, had to figure out how to fit into the towns and cities they now dominated. The core supporters of the Reformed faith, along with the newly appointed ministers, wanted to keep the strict rules and organizational structure they had in their old refugee churches. They formed groups called consistories and classes to help manage things and make sure the church stayed on track. In 1574, a big meeting called a synod was held in Dordrecht, where they decided that these groups should have the power to choose new ministers and make sure school teachers followed the church's beliefs. But not everyone was happy with these strict rules. Most people in the towns didn't like the church's strict ways, and the city leaders didn't want to lose control over who became a minister. This led to a lot of arguments and negotiations to find a way that both the church and the city leaders could live with. One of the main issues was whether the church's big meetings, called synods, had the power to make decisions that everyone had to follow. Some ministers, like Caspar Koolhaas from Leiden, refused to follow the synod's rules about things like feast days and funeral sermons. Koolhaas was eventually kicked out of the church for disagreeing, but others, like Herman Eierbertzoon and Gouda, managed to keep their jobs by fighting with the church leaders. Another big issue was who got to choose the ministers and elders. The city leaders in many towns didn't want the church to have all the power. In 1576, the States of Holland, which was like the government of the region, proposed that the city leaders should have the final say in choosing ministers. This led to a lot of back and forth between the church and the government, with both sides trying to get their way. In the end, different towns came up with their own ways of choosing ministers and elders. For example, in Dordrecht, a church committee would pick 3 candidates, the city council would approve them, and then a mixed committee of city leaders and church representatives would make the final choice. This way, both the church and the city had a say. The church also had to deal with how to include people in the community. The Reformed Church wanted to control who could take part in communion, but many people in Holland and Zeeland didn't want to follow the church's strict rules. The church decided that only those who formally joined the Reformed faith and followed its rules could take communion. But there were no laws forcing people to join, and the government didn't punish those who were excommunicated. This meant that many people became sympathizers or auditors who attended church but didn't fully join. The church also had to deal with other religious groups like Catholics, Anabaptists, and Lutherans, who set up their own churches. Once the threat of the Spanish army receded, the city leaders stopped enforcing the ban on Catholic worship. This meant that Catholics could worship in secret, and some towns even allowed open Catholic services. During the early years of the rebellion, the most pressing concern was survival against the Spanish army. The cities of Leiden, Haarlem, and Alkmaar fought hard to resist the Spanish, and the rebels even flooded the land to stop the Spanish from advancing. The Spanish were fighting wars in other places too, which made it harder for them to focus on the Netherlands. This gave the rebels a chance to regroup and negotiate with the new Spanish governor, Don John of Austria. The Pacification of Ghent, signed in 1576, was a big deal. It allowed Reformed worship in Holland and Zeeland, but protected Catholic worship elsewhere. This led to a surge in Reformed activity, with exiled ministers returning and new churches opening. But the atmosphere was tense, and there were clashes between Reformed and Catholic supporters. In Ghent, the Reformed took control and closed Catholic monasteries, leading to more unrest. The Reformed also tried to spread their influence to other cities, like Tournai and Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, a group of Reformed supporters took control of the city in 1578, banning Catholic worship and purging the city council. However, the Reformed didn't keep their power for long. The Spanish, led by Alessandro Farnese, the Duke of Parma, gradually took back control of the southern provinces. By 1585, when Antwerp fell, the Reformed had lost their strongholds in Flanders and Brabant. Many Reformed people moved north to the rebellious provinces, while others converted to Catholicism. The Counter-Reformation, which was a strong push to bring people back to the Catholic faith, made Flanders and Brabant strongholds of Catholicism once again. In the northeastern provinces of the Netherlands, the Reformed faith, which was a form of Protestant Christianity, was not as strong or aggressive as in other areas right after the Pacification of Ghent in 1576. This treaty was meant to bring peace and religious tolerance, but it didn't last long. In Friesland, it took 2 whole years for the First Reformed Church to start regular worship again after 1576. There was a middle group of people who didn't like the idea of fighting for either Catholicism or the Reformed faith, but they couldn't keep the peace as tensions grew. The turning point came when Georges de Lalling, the Count of Renenberg, who was in charge of the northeastern provinces, decided to support the Spanish king. In March 1580, he let Spanish soldiers into the city of Groningen and called on all Catholics to support the king, but most people didn't follow him. Instead, they formed an emergency assembly and rejected Renenberg's authority. They then abolished the Catholic Mass, closed convents, seized church property, and set up Reformed churches and schools. This pattern spread to other provinces like Utrecht, Overijssel, and Gelderland. The Spanish were busy with other battles, so they couldn't stop the Reformed from taking control. 2 important leaders, John of Nassau and his son William Louis, led the fight against the Spanish. They helped capture Groningen in 1594 and established Reformed churches in Drenthe in 1598. By then, the Reformed faith had become strong in all the northern provinces, where it was once weak. In these provinces, the Reformed Church was set up much like in other parts of the Netherlands, but the local authorities made sure people participated more in church activities. For example, in some places, you couldn't get married outside the church, and all children had to be baptized in the Reformed way. This made it harder for Catholics, Anabaptists, and Lutherans to practice their faith. And they became less numerous in Utrecht. There was a different approach. A priest named Herbert Duiswas wanted to create a church that was open to everyone. He didn't use a strict church structure and allowed anyone to take communion. This caused a split between the Reformed of the consistory, who wanted a more organized church, and the preachers of the Old and New Testament, who supported Duiswas's open approach. This division lasted for about 20 years, until the government stepped in and forced a compromise in 1605. Setting up the Reformed Church wasn't always smooth. In some areas, like the Veluwe, it took a long time to establish church structures. In Utrecht, it took until 1606 to have a province-wide meeting, and it wasn't until 1619 that the church order was fully settled. Even then, finding qualified ministers and elders was a challenge. By the 1580s, most parishes had ministers, but finding elders took longer. As the Reformed Church became the official church, more people joined. In Delft, the number of people taking communion grew from 617 in 1574 to 3,500 in 1621. In Haarlem, it went from 27 in 1577 to 4,000 in 1617. Some of this growth was due to people moving north to escape the fighting in the south, and some was because the Reformed Church became a symbol of respectable society. However, even with this growth, full members of the Reformed Church were still a minority, making up between 12 and 28% of the adult population in the region studied. The Reformed Church played a big role in the new Dutch Republic. Its ministers were paid by the state, and it provided chaplains for the army and navy. It also controlled poor relief in some places and vetted school teachers. The church spoke out on government issues, much like in Geneva and Zurich. For example, the synods of Zeeland urged the government to enforce stricter laws on public morals, and the government often listened. However, the Reformed Church didn't have the same level of control as other established churches in Europe. Many cities had their own systems of poor relief and allowed teachers who didn't follow the Reformed faith. The church also had to be careful not to be too strict, as people might resist. Unlike in Geneva and Scotland, the church couldn't rely on the government to enforce its rules. In the Holy Roman Empire, Reformed churches also grew, but in a different way. Instead of being formed by popular movements, they were often established by rulers who decided to reform their territories. These rulers, influenced by Reformed theologians, implemented changes in liturgy, confessions, and sometimes church structures. This process was often met with resistance, especially as time went on. By the early 1700s, some rulers had to abandon their plans to fully reform their territories. The Reformed faith in the German principalities was often the result of a ruler's personal beliefs and the advice of their counselors. This meant that the Reformed movement in Germany had a different dynamic compared to places like France, Scotland, and the Netherlands, where the Reformed faith grew from popular movements. In Germany, the Reformed cause often depended on the ruler's judgment and the influence of Reformed theologians. This showed that the Reformed message could still appeal to leaders who wanted to protect what they believed was true doctrine. The revival of Reformed strength in Germany during this period is a complex story that intertwines with the politics and religious dynamics of the time. To understand it, we need to look at the Lutheran churches, the growing assertiveness of German Catholicism, and the local traditions that were influenced by Reformed ideas, often brought by refugees from the Low Countries. In the mid-16th century, a significant split occurred within German Lutheranism. This split was between the genuine Lutherans or Jesuit-Lutherans and the followers of Philip Melanchthon, known as Philippists. The Jesuit-Lutherans were strong in places like Jena, Tübingen, and Württemberg. They believed in a strict interpretation of Luther's teachings, had a strong sense of apocalyptic foreboding, and emphasized the authority of the clergy. They also produced a lot of literature aimed at improving the moral and spiritual lives of the people, such as devil books that warned about the dangers of sin. On the other hand, the Philippists were more widespread in Silesia, Pomerania, and at the University of Wittenberg, which was the largest university in Germany at the time. They were influenced by humanism and had a more flexible, less dogmatic approach to religion. Many Philippists were educated lay people who believed in moral reform and were open to new ideas. The tensions between these two groups were intense. Denisio Lutherans often accused the Philippists of being secretly reformed, or Trictu Calvinists. This was because Melanchthon, who was a close friend and colleague of Luther, shared some ideas with John Calvin, such as a spiritual understanding of Christ's presence in the Eucharist. However, Melanchthon rejected Calvin's idea of predestination and saw many forms of worship as matters of personal choice. In the late 1550s, some theologians, encouraged by the rulers of Saxony, Brunswick, and Württemberg, started working on a document that could end the religious disputes. This effort culminated in the Formula of Concord in 1577. This document was widely adopted and became the authoritative interpretation of the Augsburg Confession, which was crucial for legal recognition under the Peace of Augsburg. The Formula of Concord taught that Christ was physically present in the Eucharist, a belief that many Philippists found difficult to accept. This forced many people and territories to make explicit choices about their religious beliefs, which they might have preferred to avoid. The conflict between the Geneseo Lutherans and the Philippists had significant consequences. For example, in Saxony, the Elector August of Saxony, who was a strong Gesio Lutheran, imprisoned several Philippists, including Kaspar Peucer, Jörg Kreckau, and Christoph Pepsel, for their alleged heretical views. Peucer, who was Melanchthon's son-in-law, spent 12 years in prison. Other intellectuals fled the country. This repression had an unexpected effect. While in prison, Pepsel became even more aligned with Calvinist ideas, especially the doctrine of predestination. The harsh treatment of those suspected of Calvinism in Saxony reflected the deep mistrust and animosity that had built up between Lutheran orthodoxy and the Reformed churches. The Second Sacramentarian Controversy of 1555 to 1562 reignited the intense debates between Lutherans and Reformed, with Lutherans often portraying Reformed ideas as seditious and dangerous. The Reformed, in turn, argued that they were simply continuing the work of purifying the church that Luther had started but not completed. These debates extended to issues like predestination, worship practices, and the nature of Christ. Lutherans were particularly concerned about the Reformed practice of breaking the bread during the Eucharist, which they saw as disrespectful. The Reformed, on the other hand, believed this practice symbolized that Christ was not physically present in the bread. Other points of contention included the Reformed rejection of exorcism during baptism and their views on the authority of the Church. The political and historical context also played a role. Reformed polemics often emphasized the threat of Catholic powers, while Gesio Lutherans pointed to the seditious nature of Reformed movements in France and the Netherlands. This led to a strong defense of the Augsburg Confession and the Formula of Concord as the best way to protect evangelical truth. Despite the intense opposition, Reformed ideas continued to spread in some regions. For example, in Strasbourg, John Storm, the rector of the Latin School, defended Reformed principles and supported the Huguenots in France. In Bremen, Albert Hardenberg, a former companion of John A. Lasco, shaped the city's theology along Reformed lines. Even after he was forced to leave, his followers continued to influence the city's religious life. In East Friesland, the conflict between the Lutheran Edzard II and the Reformed John led to a compromise where both Lutheran and Reformed churches were allowed to coexist. Reformed communities also sprang up along the Lower Rhine, especially in cities like Neusburg and Wesel, where Reformed exiles from the Low Countries played a significant role. These communities eventually formed a synodal system similar to the one in the Netherlands, which helped them organize and protect themselves against the Counter-Reformation. In cities like Hamburg, Stade, and Altona, trade links with the Baltic region led to the formation of immigrant Reformed communities from England, the Netherlands, and Wallonia. These communities added to the diversity of religious life in Germany and contributed to the spread of Reformed ideas. The story of the Reformed revival in Germany is one of conflict, adaptation, and resilience. It shows how religious beliefs and political power were closely intertwined, and how the struggle for religious identity shaped the course of German history. The revival of Reformed strength in the empire didn't just happen because of royal decrees. Sure, a lot of the changes came from decisions made by rulers, but there were other factors at play too. Education and alliances played a big role. Rulers who were taught by Philippist tutors and came from areas that supported both Lutheran and Reformed ideas were more likely to favor the Reformed faith. Some rulers were influenced by their experiences fighting alongside the Huguenots in France or the Beggars in the Low Countries, which made them see the Reformed faith in a positive light. When these rulers decided to change the church, they usually waited a while. They knew it would cause a lot of opposition. The final push often came from Reformed theologians who were fleeing persecution in other places. These theologians not only convinced the rulers to make changes, but also provided the expertise needed to implement them. Rulers also had to consider the risks. The Reformed argued that the biggest threat came from international Catholicism, while the Lutherans believed the threat was from those who wanted to change the Peace of Augsburg. As Catholicism grew stronger within the empire, the Reformed argument became more convincing. The debates over the Formula of Concord also pushed some rulers to side with the Reformed rather than the Lutherans. Ultimately, the decisions of individual rulers were crucial. Many rulers were deeply conscientious about their religious duties. They studied the issues carefully, and their decisions were often unpredictable. It wasn't uncommon for brothers to end up on opposite sides of the religious divide. One of the best examples of this is the Palatinate. The first state-mandated changes in the Palatinate came late, between 1546 and 1556, and resulted in a fairly undogmatic Melanchthonian church. The Palatinate was located on the Rhine trade routes, and many of its administrators came from families in the free imperial cities where Reformed ideas were strong. In 1559, Frederick III, a member of a collateral branch of the ruling family, became the elector of the Palatinate. Raised a Catholic, Frederick was drawn to Lutheranism through his first wife, Maria of Brandenburg-Ansbach. He fought with the emperor during the First Schmalkaldic War, which made him estranged from most Protestant princes. When he became elector, he faced the growing theological divisions in Germany, especially at the University of Heidelberg. Frederick was a devout man who often consulted the Bible at night. He felt that his position required him to resolve the disputes. He studied the Bible systematically and arranged a disputation at court between Orthodox Lutherans from Saxony and Pierre Boquin, a French-born, Wittenberg-educated minister with Reformed inclinations. Frederick also read some of Luther's later writings, which led him to conclude that the Reformed position on the Eucharist was more biblical, and that the Lutherans were too prone to unfounded invective. Boquin was one of many Reformed theologians who arrived in Heidelberg before Frederick's new theological orientation was clear. Once it became evident that Frederick was willing to shelter Reformed theologians, more followed. Zacharias Ursinus, a disciple of Melanchthon and Vermigli, was driven from Breslau as Lutheran orthodoxy strengthened. Caspar Olivianus. From Trier followed Calvin's path through the law faculties of Orleans and Bourges before studying theology in Geneva. Petrus Dathanus, who had galvanized crowds in Ypres during the Wonder Year, fled to Heidelberg and later returned to head the church in Ghent. Zanchi, a former Augustinian from Bergamo, came to Heidelberg after disagreements with Marbach over predestination. These theologians made Heidelberg a leading center of Reformed theological instruction. In 1562, Frederick implemented his first major reform. a Poliziordnung that required church attendance and harsh punishment for blasphemy, drunkenness, and other vices. A year later, a new church order was introduced which simplified baptismal and Eucharistic services, reduced the number of church holidays, and included a significant confessional document, the Heidelberg Catechism. Drafted by Ursinus and Olevianus, the Catechism explained the basics of the faith in 129 questions and answers. It was reformed in its view of the Eucharist and its ban on images in churches, but avoided the controversial topic of predestination. The Catechism became a key text in many Reformed territories and was translated into Dutch and adopted by the Dutch-speaking congregations. The Heidelberg Catechism was praised by Bullinger as the best ever published, but it also faced criticism from Lutheran Ubicitarians. Frederick was summoned to the imperial diet in 1566 to defend his church order. He argued that he had simply followed the word of God and had signed the Augsburg Confession. This response satisfied the Elector of Saxony and other leading evangelical rulers, who feared that condemning Frederick would cause a political crisis. The question was shelved, allowing Reformed doctrines to gain a legal foothold in the empire, though their status remained contested until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The leading Swiss theologians in Geneva supported Frederick during this crisis. The Palatine efforts to demonstrate the wide backing for Frederick's doctrines helped create a sense of common cause among Europe's Reformed churches. Bullinger wrote the Second Helvetic Confession, which received approval from Reformed churches across Europe. Frederick became a strong ally of Protestant movements and a promoter of pan-Protestant alliances. He sent his son, John Casimir, to aid the Huguenots during France's Second Civil War, and another son, Christopher, to study in Geneva. The Palatinate also became a center of Protestant diplomatic initiative and a home to refugees from various Reformed traditions. In the late 1560s, it saw a major debate over church discipline. Olevianus advocated for a consistorial system like Geneva's, while the Church Ordinance of 1564 established a system closer to Zurich's. In 1568, an English student, George Withers, proposed a debate on the need for a consistory with full disciplinary powers. Thomas Erastus, a professor of medicine, led the opposition, arguing that state control over the church was necessary to prevent church tyranny. Erastus's writings, along with those of Bullinger, Beza, and Qualther, contributed to the debate. Frederick's final resolution in 1570 established a body of elders in each church to oversee operations and exercise discipline. Sinners could be admonished, and after 1571, suspended from the sacraments. If they didn't repent, the matter was turned over to secular authorities. Regular gatherings of ministers were also established to discuss scripture and critique each other's preaching. This system combined elements of consistorial discipline with the classic German territorial church under princely supervision. Frederick succeeded in turning his territories along the Rhine into a strong Reformed stronghold, but his eldest son, Ludwig, never followed his father's religious path. Ludwig, who was already grown when Frederick chose the Reformed faith, remained a Lutheran. As the ruler of the Upper Palatinate, Ludwig delayed the introduction of the new Reformed church order. When Frederick died in 1576, Ludwig became the elector and restored Lutheranism throughout the Palatinate. He even required all university professors to sign the Formula of Concord, a document that affirmed Lutheran beliefs, which appeared the following year. Frederick, knowing his son's strong Lutheran convictions, made sure to provide for his younger son John Casimir in his will. John Casimir, a supporter of the Huguenots in France and a committed Reformed Christian, received a separate inheritance. This included territories around Kaiserslautern, where he established an academy at Neustadt. This academy became a refuge for many Reformed counselors and theologians who were forced out of Heidelberg, including important figures like Ursinus, Zanchi, and Athanus. Ludwig's restoration of Lutheranism was short-lived. He died after just 7 years, and according to imperial law, John Casimir became the regent for Ludwig's young son, Frederick IV. John Casimir surrounded the young Frederick with reformed tutors and reinstated the church order that Frederick III had established. Heidelberg once again became a center for reformed education and a hub for Protestant diplomacy. The Palatinate was the only large German principality to establish a Reformed church for about 2 decades after the Augsburg Diet of 1566. However, a few small territories between Heidelberg and the Dutch border soon followed. The Protestant movement in Wied took on a Reformed character by the mid-1560s. They accepted the Heidelberg Catechism in 1564 and adopted a Presbyterian synodal church order in 1575. Count Ludwig of Sayn-Wittgenstein, a neighboring territory, was a theology enthusiast who could read the Old Testament in Hebrew. After meeting Reformed theologians, Beza and Bullinger, in Switzerland, he began corresponding with them regularly. He introduced a Reformed church order in his territory as early as 1563. When the Lutherans regained control in Heidelberg, Ludwig brought Olevianus, a key Reformed figure, to Berleburg to restructure the church. One of the most influential leaders in the Lower Rhine region who championed the Reformed cause was John VI, Count of Nassau-Dillenburg, from 1559 to 1584. He was the younger brother of William of Orange and Louis of Nassau. Despite his small territory of about 50,000 people, John played a significant role in promoting the Reformed faith in both the Rhineland and the Netherlands. His involvement in the Dutch resistance against Philip II of Spain led him to embrace the Reformed faith between 1572 and 1574. John introduced changes to his territorial church cautiously, with the help of exiled theologians. Pezel, who arrived in Dillenburg in 1577 after being released from prison in Saxony, encouraged John to act. In 1577, John had the Eucharist celebrated with the Fractio Panis, the breaking of bread, in his chapel. The next year, a general synod for the county adopted a new predestinarian confession of faith written by Pezel. This confession recognized the Augsburg Confession insofar as it agrees with the confessions of other evangelical Reformed churches outside Germany. In 1580, the Palatine Order of Services was implemented in Nassau-Dillenburg. The Dutch National Synod of Middelburg drafted a plan for a fully autonomous Presbyterial Synodal Church order for the Low Countries in 1581, which Nassau-Dillenburg adopted in 1582 with some refinements. John extended this church system to other neighboring counties in 1586 at the General Synod of Herborn. This created a common church system for Nassau, Dillenburg, Wittgenstein, Solms-Braunfels, and Wied. These small principalities adopted a church organization similar to the French and Dutch models, with local consistorial discipline and a selection of ministers by local presbyteries, though the territorial rulers retained the right to approve clerical nominations and appoint inspectors for church visitations and synods. The changes were not easy for the local population, who were deeply attached to Lutheran rituals. When the new service for the Lord's Supper was introduced in Herborn, many parishioners left the church rather than participate. It took time to win them back, and by 1583 the number of communicants had increased to 545. However, some rural parishes and towns like Siegen continued to resist, with village schoolmasters and church elders occasionally boycotting communion. John persevered in his efforts to reconcile his subjects with the new church order. He continued to support his brothers in the Low Countries with military aid and served as stadtholder in Gelderland from 1578 to 1580, advancing the interests of the Reformed Church. During the Lutheran interlude in the Palatinate, John became the leading princely champion of the Reformed cause in the empire. He offered diplomatic support to Bremen when it faced pressure to accept the Formula of Concord and sent Pebzel to strengthen its theological resistance. John and his fellow Wetterau counts backed Gebhard Trutz von Waldburg in his war to defend his right to the Prince-Bishopric of Cologne, which, if successful, would have made the territory Protestant. John also played a crucial role in the education of the young Count Philip Ludwig of Hanau-Munzenberg, ensuring he received a Reformed education. This inspired Philip to carry out a second Reformation after he came of age in 1591. John was a significant patron of higher education, founding the Academy at Herborn in 1586, which attracted distinguished scholars like Pebzel, Olevianus, Johannes Althusius, and Johann Piscator. Piscator's Bible translation, published in 1602, competed with Luther's version in Reformed territories, though it was less popular due to its less literary style. The pace of second Reformations increased in the 1580s for two main reasons. The drafting and promotion of the Formula of Concord pushed those who could not accept its teachings toward the Reformed camp, and political and military developments made Catholicism seem more threatening. Inside the empire, Catholic military action with Spanish support secured the prince-bishoprics of Cologne and Munster in the mid-1580s. Other prince-bishoprics, like Würzburg and Paderborn, saw the introduction of the Jesuits and efforts to force inhabitants back into the Roman Church. Abroad, the cities of Flanders and Brabant fell to Spanish troops, and the Catholic League pressured Henry III to revoke Protestant rights in France. These events prompted rulers in both Eastern and Western Germany to ally against the Catholic threat and to implement changes in their church orders. For a brief period, it seemed that electoral Saxony, the cradle of the Reformation and the most powerful German state, might lead the way. In 1586, the young Christian, influenced by crypto-Calvinism, acceded to the Saxon throne. He had been tutored by a preceptor who lost his post in the 1574 crackdown and grew close to Nicholas Krell, a jurist with Reformed leanings. Christian began to modify the ecclesiastical status quo in his territory, removing the requirement for clerics to sign the Formula of Concord, replacing Orthodox Lutherans in universities and administrative posts with Philippist or Reformed partisans, and introducing a new prayer book, catechism, and Bible with Reformed commentary. In 1591, he removed the formula of exorcism from baptism and joined an evangelical alliance to support Henry of Navarre in France. The alliance between Saxony, the Palatinate, Brandenburg, Hesse, and Anhalt to aid Navarre ignited excitement among Germany's Reformed, who imagined a golden age was dawning. However, fate intervened. Christian I. An avid hunter fell ill after insisting on riding despite feeling unwell in September 1591, and died. His brother stepped in as regent for a young heir, reversed the territory's religious course, and reimposed the Formula of Concord. The crackdown on Calvinists was harsh, with leading clerics and advisors jailed. After 10 years in prison, Krell was tried and executed for alleged crimes against the emperor and public peace. Although Saxony's Second Reformation was short-lived, two other territories that signed the 1591 Pact, Anhalt and Hesse, enacted ecclesiastical changes. Anhalt, a long-standing Philippist stronghold, was ruled by John George I and his brothers from 1586 to 1603. The Second Reformation began in 1590, when John George decided to eliminate the exorcism ceremony from baptism, a change he believed Luther would have approved. However, This decision led to clerical protests and pushed John George further into the Reformed camp. He was encouraged by his younger brother, Christian of Anhalt, a strong advocate of militant Protestantism. Christian had served at the Saxon court during Christian I's reign and was influenced by Crell. He led the 1591 expedition to aid Navarre and openly embraced the Reformed faith in France. Christian later served the Palatine electors, becoming the leading architect of the Protestant Union and the Palatine intervention in Bohemia that sparked the 30 Years' War. Christian advised his brother to enact more changes in Anhalt's church order, which John George did after marrying the daughter of John Casimir of the Palatinate. The Reformation work of 1596 removed images, crucifixes, and altars from Anhalt's churches and introduced a Eucharistic service with the Fractio Panis. Over the next decade, the Heidelberg Catechism and Palatine liturgy were adopted in parts of Anhalt. Philip of Hesse, a powerful ruler in the 16th century, was known for his efforts to unite Protestants. When he died in 1567, his lands were divided among his 4 sons. This division led to intense religious conflicts, especially because Philip had set up a unique church system with synods and elders, which was rare among Lutherans. His sons, particularly Ludwig of Hesse-Marburg, promoted a strict version of Lutheranism, causing tension with his more moderate brother, Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel. Wilhelm, who ruled Hesse-Kassel, opened his territories to people who disagreed with the strict Lutheran views. His son, Maurice, was a brilliant humanist and patron of the arts. Maurice married Juliana of Nassau, who was Reformed, and this influenced his religious policies. After securing his inheritance, Maurice introduced a series of changes in his territory, including the use of the Heidelberg Catechism, the removal of images from churches, and the introduction of a new ritual for communion. He also set up a governing body called a consistorium to oversee church affairs. The fear of Catholicism and the desire for a more moderate form of Lutheranism led to similar changes in other small territories. Arnold II of Bentheim-Steinfurt-Tecklenburg, influenced by his studies in Strasbourg, introduced Reformed practices in his lands. John I of Zweibrücken, initially a supporter of Lutheran orthodoxy, shifted to Reformed ideas after studying theology. He adopted the Heidelberg Catechism and introduced elements of church discipline. Simon VI of Lippe, educated by a Melanchthonian tutor, also embraced Reformed ideas, implementing changes like the removal of altars and statues from churches and establishing a consistorium. These changes, while generally accepted by the clergy, often faced strong resistance from the people. For example, when Maurice of Hesse-Kassel tried to remove images from churches, his ministers were attacked. In Lippe, the town of Lemgo rebelled against the new church order, leading to years of conflict. The resistance was so intense that it discouraged other rulers from making similar changes. John Sigismund of Brandenburg, who converted to Reformed ideas, initially tried to implement changes, but faced such strong opposition that he had to limit his efforts to areas he controlled directly. John Sigismund's conversion was influenced by his visit to Heidelberg, where he encountered Reformed theologians. Despite his deep commitment to Reformed ideas, he faced significant resistance from his subjects. When he tried to introduce Reformed worship in the Berlin Cathedral, it led to riots and violent protests. The estates of Brandenburg forced him to allow people to continue practicing Lutheranism, and he had to declare that he would not impose his religious views on anyone. By the early 17th century, the wave of second Reformations had largely ended. While Reformed territories were fewer than Lutheran ones, they were significant. Reformed churches existed in about a dozen princely territories, 5 free imperial cities, and several smaller areas. The Reformed population in Germany was estimated at around 1 million out of a total population of 16 million. 2 of the 7 electors, those of Brandenburg and the Palatinate, were Reformed. The Reformed churches in Germany often differed from those in Geneva and other parts of Europe. In some territories, like the Wetterau counties and those near the Dutch border, the churches closely resembled those in France and the Netherlands. However, in many other places, the changes were limited to liturgical reforms and the introduction of the Heidelberg Catechism. The centralization of church control through the creation of consistoriums was common, but not all territories adopted the strict discipline found in Geneva. The Second Reformations were driven by a combination of factors, including the influence of Melanchthonian ideas and the desire to resist strict Lutheran orthodoxy. While some rulers, like Frederick III of the Palatinate, embraced the idea of church discipline, others, like those in Bremen, resisted it. The resistance to religious changes in many areas showed that confessional identity had become deeply rooted in the German territories, making it difficult for rulers to impose new religious practices. The impact of these Second Reformations on state building is a topic of debate. Some argue that the emphasis on church discipline and moral reform helped create a more obedient population, while others note that the resistance to these changes often undermined princely authority. The most striking aspect of these reformations was the willingness of some rulers to cede power to independent church bodies, especially in the Palatinate and Nassau-Dillenburg. This willingness to share power with the church was a unique feature of the German Reformed movement. The story of the Reformation in England is a tale of dramatic changes and shifting alliances, much like a grand play with many acts and characters. At its heart, it's about how a country's church transformed from being part of the Catholic world to becoming a unique Protestant church with a blend of old and new beliefs. It all started when King Henry VIII wanted a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she couldn't give him a son. The Pope wouldn't allow it, so Henry broke away from the Catholic Church and declared himself the head of the Church of England. This was a huge step, and it set the stage for the changes to come. When Henry's son, Edward VI, became king, he was just a boy. But the people around him, like Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, were deeply influenced by Reformed ideas from Switzerland and Germany. They wanted to make the Church of England more like the churches in those places, with simpler services and a clearer focus on the Bible. They got rid of many Catholic practices and introduced new books and rituals that reflected these changes. But Edward's reign was short, and after he died, his half-sister Mary, who was a devout Catholic, became queen. Mary tried to bring the country back to the Catholic Church, and she burned many Protestants who refused to convert. This period was very hard for Protestants, and many fled to other countries. When Mary died, her half-sister Elizabeth I took the throne. Elizabeth wanted to find a middle ground, a way to keep the country stable and avoid the kind of religious turmoil that had happened before. She kept many of the reformed changes that Edward had introduced, but also kept some traditional practices. This created a church that was uniquely English, neither fully Catholic nor fully Reformed like those in other countries. However, not everyone was happy with this compromise. Some people, called Puritans, wanted even more changes to make the church more like the Reformed churches in Switzerland and Germany. They pushed for simpler services, more Bible reading, and a different way of organizing the church. Elizabeth and her advisors had to work hard to keep these groups from causing too much trouble. Throughout the rest of the 1500s, the Church of England continued to evolve. Some people wanted to keep it more traditional, while others wanted more reformed changes. This tension led to debates and conflicts. But by the end of the century, the church had a stable structure that would last for many years. The Reformation in England, like in other parts of Europe, shows how much rulers and their advisors can shape a country's religious life. It also highlights the importance of personal beliefs and the influence of foreign ideas. In the end, the Church of England became a unique blend of old and new, reflecting the complex history and diverse opinions of its people. This story is a reminder that change is often a long and complicated process, shaped by many different factors.